Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Beatrice and part of the Global Wellness Institute team, and we also have Susie Ellis and Nancy Davis on, the both head of our organization. The call today is a Global Wellness Institute initiative collaboration call and hosted by the Wellness at Work initiative. They are hosting a series of 3 calls in total, and we'll experience part 2 today. Part 1 is already posted on our website if anybody wants to listen to it. The topic is Leading in the Next Normal, Setting the Agenda to Thrive, Connecting Gender, Diversity, Inclusion, and Workplace Wellbeing. I'm delighted to now introduce Rene Bujard, who is the chair of the initiative and also an expert in workplace wellness. Thank you so much, Rene, and also Mim and Joel for organizing and hosting the call today. And over to you, Rene.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for showing up. We are really excited about this series, Leading in the Next Normal, resetting the agenda to thrive, because obviously we're all in the middle of pandemic, social unrest, economic troubles, climate crisis, you name it. And there's also some wonderful things happening around the world, ways that we're connecting. Our first webinar was on leadership. That was last month. This one is going to be about connecting gender equity, diversity, and inclusion to workplace well-being. And I am super delighted to introduce the host, the co-hosts of it. I've had the good fortune to work with Mim Senft and Joel Hershfield for a number of years now. And so as I read these bios, I want you to just take this in. They're impressive folks. I'm going to start with Mim. Mim is the CEO of Motivity Partnerships, a company focused on developing integrated, measurable, and culturally specific health, well-being, gender, diversity, and inclusion strategies for companies. She is also the co-founder of Global Women for Wellbeing, and I can tell you as a member of GW4W, it's a fabulous organization, global nonprofit, research-based organization focused on empowering more healthy female leadership at all levels for a more sustainable world. Mim has 20 plus years of corporate experience working with more than 70 companies, including on-site wellness program strategy development and project plan execution for Goldman Sachs through Optum Health. Her background includes benefits underwriting in the US and globally, HR policy development, finance and corporate health and well-being evidence-based programming, technology, and training. Beyond her role as a member of the Wellness at Work initiative, Mim is also an ambassador of the Global Wellness Institute and a former board member of the National Wellness Institute. So just reading all that, we've got like a powerhouse in the workplace wellness arena with Mim, as we do with her co-host Joel Hershfield from Canada. Joel is the Chief Financial Officer of 2 Province of Manitoba's special operating agencies in Canada. He is also the Healthy Workplace Wellness Advisor for one of those agencies. His knowledge of lean business practices, along with his understanding of healthy workplace concepts, give him a unique viewpoint and skill set to improve the workplace for all. And I cannot be more happy that Mim and Joel have organized this for all of us to help all of us in our organizations lead and live and reset our organizations from a foundation of well-being. So I'm going to hand the mic over, Joel, to you and Mim.
Oh, you muted, Mim. You need to unmute on the bottom left.
Go. Okay, there we go. I'm unmuted now. Wonderful. So thank you, Rene. What a kind introduction, and it is truly a pleasure to be here with everyone today. I want to start out with a question. What if our companies and our communities actually had healthier workforces? And what if companies could have teams that are more resilient during change and crisis? I think with our current world, this is front and center for so many of us. So Beatrice, if you'd be kind enough to put up the first slide, that would be great as our intro. And as Rene said, we're really pleased to be here today to talk about the connection between workplace well-being and diversity and inclusion. We usually don't put these 2 pieces together. And it is a big miss and something that we have a real opportunity to do moving forward. So I'd ask Beatrice if you'd be kind enough to move to the next slide. This is kind of a busy slide, and normally I would not put this much information on a slide. But when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we tend to think about it in very small buckets. And in order to truly solve for this, we need to start to expand our thinking. We need to really start thinking about design thinking when we are talking about diversity and inclusion. So what does it mean if we are not included for the workforce? How does that impact health and well-being? Well, I think most of us know that if you are marginalized, if you are dealing with microaggressions, if you are seen as different for any reason, it could be things like being introverted, coming from an immigrant background, having a different educational background. There are just so many different pieces of the puzzle that we're not fully addressing. And when those folks are marginalized, they are not engaged at work. Not only are they not engaged, but because they're dealing with not being seen, it has a deep impact to their health and well-being. And that ties back to the corporate bottom line. So there is an actual financial hit to companies that are looking at this through a much more inclusive lens. We tend to want to be equal. We want to treat everybody equally, but that's not the same as being equitable. So you might go out and decide, we're going to buy a bicycle for everybody across the company. Yay, bicycle, we're going to get people moving. What a great gift to give to everyone. But what if it's not the right fit for you? What if you're too short or too tall for that bicycle? What if you don't know how to ride the bicycle? What if you can't safely ride the bicycle or even keep it at your house? And that kind of is a metaphor for what happens around health and well-being and the way we approach diversity and inclusion in many of our organizations. Now, the good news is that we have made progress. I mean, we've made great progress over the past 100 years. So if we can go to the next slide, Beatrice, that would be great. And we know that we have more women in the workplace, but we wanted to share with you just a few pieces of information to kind of level set a little bit. I don't think there's anybody on this call that would say, we want to wait 98 years to achieve gender equity. I think that's pretty clear. I think when we look at what's going on around the world, this outcry about what happened to George Floyd, it is clear that we have not addressed racism in the way that we need to. It needs to be rooted out in a much more intentional way if we're truly going to have inclusive workforces. And we've seen great progress for the LGBTQ plus community. As an example, I am astounded in my own lifetime to see how much change has been made. But that is not true in every country. And it is not true in every city, depending on where you are. So there is a lot of opportunity for us to make positive change. And I kind of equate that to the Chinese symbol for crisis, which combines danger. And I think just going back to what Rene said, there's a lot of danger going on out there for all of us. But it also opens up this window for opportunity, for real positive change to move towards a more sustainable world. So with that, I will turn it over to Joel.
Thanks, Mim. Beatrice, can you just show the last slide? So thank you, everybody, for showing up today. We're thrilled you're here. Our GWI initiative group began discussing our 3 sessions back in January, February. Unfortunately, with what's happened in the world over the last several months, this particular session's relevance and importance is heightened even more so. So this slide was created by one of our organization's STEP students. She and I worked together on this. And because unfortunately there's copyright laws and I can't just pick and choose from what's out there. So, you know, this is a quick thing that we thought would highlight what many current organizations look like today. And as I looked at it just recently, I thought, you know, if you look at it in a different way, it's so easy for the group, that particular group, to hire someone. They can just as easily hire anyone. So that's really one less barrier that we should be having to deal with. The hiring process should be far more open and transparent. So I look at this as really a two-way street, this cartoon. Thanks, Beatrice. I think you can get off that screen. So I now have the pleasure of introducing Karlyn Percil. I met Karlyn last year when we co-authored an article for our GWI initiative on this very workplace wellness topic. So please check it out. Maybe we'll get more hits on our site. To best and most succinctly introduce Karlyn, I can simply say that she is a force. So please welcome Karlyn Percil.
Hold on. I'm going to say my thanks again. Thank you so much, Joel. It's a pleasure to be here. And I am Karlyn Percil, CEO of KDPM Consulting Group, Inc. And a lot of our work is focused around creating more inclusive and equitable workplaces for all, especially where all Black lives can thrive. And during my 20-year career in the financial industry on Bay Street, one of the things that came up a lot was the lack of ability for racialized people to truly thrive in the workplace. And it wasn't something we talked about. It's not as bold and brave and deep as we're having the conversation here today. And one thing that I'd like to, for each and every one of you to walk away with is, as you go back to your communities, to your workplaces, I want you to remind your colleagues, your friends, your family members that we can't get to true equity if we do not center intersectionality, if we don't center race, we don't center socioeconomic differences, as well as LGBTQ two-spirited people. When we talk about achieving, equity in the workplace, it's extremely important for us to center that. And in Canada, 1 in 5 face racial discrimination. And these are only those who report, and we know it's also very underreported. And more people are coming to terms with the language around racial microaggression and how every single day, Blacks and racialized people in the workplace are facing minor, we call them paper cuts or mosquito bites, discrimination in the workplace. And it's not always evident. So a lot of workplaces are continuing without really taking a look at not only the workplace wellness strategy, but also their leadership strategies as well, because the experiences of Black leaders in the workplace is very nuanced. So today, as we talk about this very important topic, when we talk about gender equity, I implore you to add race to that card as well, because we can't get to true gender equity unless we center the experiences around intersectionality, around race, and LGBTQ, and all the other identifying factors that we go by. So I'm really excited for today's conversation. I'm really hoping to see some real change as we continue to work together for true equity for all.
Wow, thank you so much, Karlyn. Yeah, beautifully said. And I think it underscores, again, when we talk about diversity, we have to be very clear that focusing on diversity is not the same as focusing on racism. So thank you for pointing that out. Our next speaker is well known to many of you in the Global Wellness Institute world, Gina Diez Barroso. And Gina is the president and CEO of Grupo, Diarq, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Gina, and serves on the Global Wellness Institute Board of Directors. She is the founder and president of Centro, the first university in Mexico focused on creative studies, and president and founder of Dahlia Empower, a global initiative creating empowerment for women around the world. Gina lives in Mexico City. I had the great pleasure of having breakfast with her in January and know that her passion for positive change is inspiring. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gina.
Thank you, Mim. Thank you, everybody. Well, this is, as you said, my passion. And I'm very, I want to tell you that I was very surprised because in the beginning when I founded Dahlia 4 years ago, I thought Mexico was like leading this disaster of inequality. And 8 years ago, I had the pleasure of being named the representative of Mexico at the G20, in the W20, and then in the B20 as well, in the Business 20. And to my surprise, every single member of the G20 complains of the same thing. Inequality is around the world. It's a thing that happens. It's a ridiculous thing that happens because when you go to the B20, which is the Business 20, this is not just a matter of the thing that needs to be done. This is a business issue. I was talking to Christine Lagarde not too long ago, and this is a business matter. Every time this cartoon that you just put in which, you know, you did it as a cartoon, but unfortunately, it's an everyday picture. This is an everyday picture in everyday company. So every time people stand up from that, if it's a meeting, if it's a conference, if it's a whatever, every time people stand up from that table, they leave a check on the table. So, you know, diversity and inclusion and race, it's a business matter. Besides being a normal and a wonderful thing to accomplish for every single member in the world, it is a business matter. So we need to fight it as a business matter. We need to say that this is the thing that it should happen. The CVs that, you know, when you try to go into a company, it should be a blind CV. We don't need to put a picture. We don't need to put a religion. We don't need to put a race. It should be a blind CV, because people definitely have microaggressions, you know, as Karlyn said, every single time, every single day, even in, you know, in schools. So one of the things that we are doing and we're, as you said, we're going global. Anything that is not measured cannot really have you know, the impact that needs to have. So we are creating an index of gender, race, and diversity in companies. So the minute the companies are measured, they will realize what they're doing. Because, you know, even if you go to humongous companies or, you know, the Fortune 500, or you go to startups, or you go to middle-sized companies, they don't have a clue on what they're doing. So we're creating this index for the companies to be measured. And once they're measured, they can do something. And if they do something and they do it well, they can be published in a book. So they have to have a, you know, a what to do thing, a what to do list, so they can really make a change. And I have a hope, I really have a hope that this can change, because we cannot continue to this, from the microaggressions to the really bullying in companies and in life, you know, with women, with men, with LGBTQ+, and with race. You know, this cannot continue. So this is my work, my everyday work, my task, and my goal is to reach 100 million women in the next 10 years. Thank you.
Wow. Inspiring, as I said. And I would underscore, as somebody who's been in the health and well-being space for as long as I've been, for too long, we are not making actual measurement around whether or not we are progressing forward. We talk about engagement numbers. We talk about all the affinity groups that we have. But as Gina said, this is truly a business discussion. And that if we want to move forward, have the sustainable world, be better at innovation, we have to get very serious about understanding first where the issues are, where the gaps are, and how we are actually going to measure them. So thank you. And our third speaker, another incredible advocate for diversity and inclusion, Rene Bujard, who is the Human Resources Director for Prescriptions and Consumer GBUs at Galderma. He was the Global Human Resources Director for Oxfam International, so also brings in a nonprofit viewpoint, and held various global HR roles at Procter & Gamble. He's a well-known speaker in Europe on topics related to diversity and inclusion. And I had the great pleasure of meeting Rene last year when we were all together in London, and also was part of the GW4W Paris Roundtable. So Rene, welcome, and I'll turn the conversation over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to GWI, GW4W as well for inviting me. I'm humbled to be there. As you said, I'm Rene Bujard, middle-aged man, white, Caucasian, with a mixed Swiss and Italian background. And I come from a fairly lower middle-class background growing up. I became aware of exclusion fairly early in my life. I was always a bit overweight, and I already, you know, got stigmas from that from my friends and colleagues. Also being raised in a minority religion versus my friends, so the only one not going to a religious class, and but I didn't know what to make with that. But I became good at fitting in and kind of being, you know, liked by my friends. It's only 10 years in my career that I began to realize what was going on in all these dynamics. Because early on in Europe, in the 90s, for us, it was this thing in the US, diversity and inclusion. You know, there had been this segregation and they needed to deal with that. But look at us, we're diverse. There's a French, an Italian, a German in the room. People not realizing, yes, different nationality, but otherwise all the same. It started with me with Myers-Briggs or MBTI, because I also felt different from my colleagues. But, you know, and I didn't want them to know what was going on in there, because they'll know I was not the right profile to be a leader. And, but I did it, and they told me, no, you're okay. And actually you bring diversity of viewpoint. And so all these things really helped build my understanding. And why am I saying that? It's because I think for people like me, you know, who tick very few boxes of diversity, it's very important to learn these concepts from a minority point of view. And so when you want to engage your colleagues, you know, and again, if they're white, male, middle-aged, you know, you need to find the place where they belong to a minority group that has been historically excluded. It's not enough for them to say, I have a daughter, therefore it's important to me. I don't think it's enough to really understand the concept. In Europe, I still think we're lagging behind miles, you know, and years from a racial and ethnicity point of view. I still remember one of my VPs for HR in Europe at P&G saying, oh, we're so busy with restructuring, Rene, we can't do more on diversity and inclusion, we'll just do gender. And we won't do anything else until we fix gender. And I said, you're not going to fix anything, gender, until you do everything else, because it's really about learning the concepts and the behaviors and all of that. Even when I worked at the INGO, I was surprised to know that we were trying to build Southern leaders. And I said, I've never heard that in the private sector. What's this thing you call Southern leaders? And I realized it was a term for racial and ethnic diversity, but that somehow didn't make them feel guilty about the situation. Because, you know, the choice of word is very important. You know, Karlyn, you call them paper cuts, and that's clearly was one of them, a big paper cut. But I knew my job was going to move to Nairobi. I wanted to make sure I was replaced by someone from the Global South, because I thought if we all go with our jobs when the senior leadership team relocates, people will say, where's the rebalancing of power? And I stayed until the end to make sure that we found someone, very strong leader, and I was able to handle and give the job over. Looking for another job, I wanted to stay in a nonprofit. I was appointable finalist for 2 senior roles, one for a UN agency based in New York, one for a large NGO in London. In both cases, the job went to the other finalist, who was an African woman in both cases. Tough for me to take at the individual level, but still I was very pleased that at the systemic level, we have qualified candidates, diverse, and they are getting the jobs, because for centuries, that was not the case. So I'm not complaining. And in fact, I've had to explain to a lot of my colleagues that correcting a systemic wrong is not reverse discrimination, but we really need to engage with the other groups. So one of my pleas is, if we really want to change things, we need to engage men. We need to engage white people as well. For many years now, we've invested in the minority groups, and it's been very important. Create a caucus and help people get together, learn the skills. But the other group is still a little bit lost, doesn't understand what's going on, even if they're well intended. And so I think this is critical going forward, that if we want investments to succeed in the future and the needle really to move, we also need to invest in the other group, whatever the variable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rene. And now we're going to move to a very interesting, I think, and engaging panel discussion. We know what some of the gaps are, but how do we start to tackle some of these issues? And so we're going to bring all 3 of our speakers in and go through some of the questions that you were kind enough to answer on your registration page. But before we go to that, we'll have Joel share just a little bit about what we found out from the questions that you were kind enough to answer.
Thanks, Mim. So I had the most recent listing, and there were 4 questions which you were kind enough to answer. Generally speaking, the first 3 questions summaries ranged from 60 to 65% yeses. We have diversity, we've moved it forward, we have some health and wellness systems. The last question, which asked about whether the people felt inclusive, not surprisingly, was in the 50s. Yet that, of course, is really the most important one. And it's true, it's step 1 is hiring people of all, anyone. The next step is to find out and make sure we're including them in everything, in what we do. And the only way is to ask. I spoke to a couple of our warehouse employees and asked them if they are asked to do the very same tasks as any other employee, and second, had they been subject to any negative comments. I was glad to hear their answers were what should have been happening. And so then I thought, well, this question presupposes that you are generally inclusive or that you generally engage your staff. Maybe that's not the case. And perhaps as leaders, when we begin to be inclusive of these groups, our overall leadership skills and our organization will definitely excel. So now let's start the panel discussion, and I'll turn it over to Mim again.
Great. So great way to lead into this discussion. We're going to take it from the macro level first. And so the question is, how do racism, diversity, gender, and inclusion challenges directly impact the health and well-being of a company's workforce? So Karlyn, I'll start with you if you'd like to jump in.
Mm-hmm. How does it impact? It actually shortens the lifespan of Black individuals. And funny enough, I recently watched a TED Talk by Dr. David R. Williams, where he talked about a student from Yale University who had a stellar career, but he died at 62 due to a blood clot. And there have been more and more research looking at the impact of those paper cuts, the daily microaggressions. And micro is not because it's small, micro because it's usually from one-on-one. When there is an unconscious racial bias and certain words are said or actions, or in some cases, the workplace did not prioritize the needs of the most marginalized groups, and the dominant group, let's say in a particular workplace, it's white individuals, so folks, it means that the culture will be driven by those individuals, which means that the nuances of the Black experience or the racialized experience is filled with those systemic barriers, whether it's in the hiring process. And we've seen examples where when you remove the name, or in some cases, when there isn't sponsorship. So even within the workplace itself, there isn't that ability to thrive. And when the paper cuts happen, and that is what makes microaggression or micro insults or macro assaults so deadly, is that there isn't a language for it. Workplace wellness individuals are not trained on it. People leaders don't know what it is, so they cannot coach or guide. So there isn't that trust for me as an employee to come to, let's say you, Mim, who's my supervisor, and say, I feel like, I don't know, something happened. I don't feel safe at work and it's impacting me. I don't have the language for it, so I can't even come to you. So we sit with this discomfort, with this discrimination. We internalized it, and this is where the internalized oppression or internalized racism happens. And you know what happens when we store our issues in our tissues? It needs an outing, and if it doesn't get an outing, guess what, right? It manifests into something else. So in that TED Talk, and I encourage everyone to watch it, I'll put the link there later. He talked and the research shows that for Black individuals, yes, there is a shorter lifespan. And because of that, and it starts, from school, it starts from the indoctrination, as you know, I'm pretty sure a lot of you have heard about Jane Elliott's work around school is about indoctrination. This is where systemic racism is taught. So we have been carrying this not just in the workplace. And that's what, I really want everybody to understand. It begins in school, it begins in our childhood. So we've been carrying this all this time. And now that we're in the workplace, it manifests, and which impacts our lifespan, and which also have an impact on our community as well.
Well, thank you. And I think when we're specifically talking about health and well-being, just another little stat that we'll share is that in the United States, Black women die in childbirth at 4 times the rate of their white counterparts. So when you're talking about employee benefits design and maternity benefits and these things, again, this is where this intersection starts to happen around these pieces. So Gina, I'll turn the conversation over to you to get your perspective.
Thank you. Well, this is really something really very, very important, because one of the issues also is the fact that, when you go into a workforce and you are a minority, talking about if you're Black, if you're Latino, if you're LGBTQ+, you don't have a chance. And I'm talking about a chance to aim to be, let's say, in the C-suites in a company. So people talk about empowerment. I don't believe in empowerment. I believe in having your own power. And in boys and girls, babies, little baby boy, baby girl, they are born with the same power. So what happens when they get out of the hospital? It's, culture and education. They still have their power. I mean, nobody's taking the power out of the little girl or the minority. It's just that due to education and due to where they live and due to discrimination, they don't find their own power. So when they go to the workforce or they go to school, they are aiming to normal job with very low pay, and they're okay to be bullied. They're okay to be struggling in their life because they're either Black, they're Latinos, they belong to LGBTQ+. Do you think they're aimed to be a CEO? It's not even in their head because they don't have the power. So what we're trying to do in what we're trying to train them, we're not trying to empower anybody. We're not like super people that empower people. I mean, we're trying to help them to find their own power and to aim for leadership positions because they can aim to leadership positions. But you know, it's a life of struggle. It's a life of fighting because they don't have the same, you know, paved road as anybody else has. You know, you can think that I'm blonde and I'm white, but I'm Latino. and no, I mean, and don't laugh. I mean, when I cross that border, I am discriminating. Imagine imagine if I wouldn't be blonde and white. So I know what it means, and I'm trying to help these women and this group of LGBTQ+ that they can aim to be in that C-suite. They can aim to be sitting in that board position. It doesn't matter the skin color. It doesn't matter the sexual preference. It doesn't matter if they're, you know, whatever they believe in. If they're capable, they can aim to be in those positions. And they have to find their own power, and they have to be ready since they're born to be educated in the same schools. And that is the problem. You know, the problem is that the minute they're born, that power is completely lost in those little systems. And they grow like that because that's the way they're supposed to live. And that is definitely not fair. And that is when wellness and you know, this, obviously where we're born, you know, where's wellness here? It doesn't exist.
Right.
You know?
And to your point too, where does this come from? Right? So the cultural norms that need to be addressed behind this, the decades and centuries of being told that people that have darker skin are not equal, that women are meant to really be the major caregivers, and that's really their major role, that it changes, that we look at family men in organizations in a different way than we look at working mothers. And I'd ask you to think about those two phrases a little bit, because that is a cultural norm that really, I mean, it comes out in different ways, but around the world. To level set a little bit, I think the number now is that there are 37 female CEOs in the Fortune 500. None of them are Black or Latina. There are only 4 Black male CEOs in the Fortune 500. And again, it underscores why we need to get some of these deeply rooted beliefs and biases out front, not just having these affinity groups. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rene and get your thoughts.
There you go. No, there you go. I'm unmuted now. I think it's already been beautifully said. I mean, one little catchword phrase that I've developed for myself is people should stop wasting the energy to conform and use all the energy to perform. And so for me, it's about energy. And again, every time somebody is not recognized for who they are, that saps into their energy. You know, and it's like if you start cutting a tree, you chop at it a little bit, and it becomes weaker and weaker. And so for me, it's about allowing people to be who they are, even if they're different, whatever is the variable, whatever is the difference. But it's also about educating the line managers to understand this difference and to know how to work and how to support the people. Because again, otherwise these guys in the C-suite, they're like fishes in water, you know, and they're surprised that people are not successful when we throw them in water, but they're cats, for instance, you know. But they want to help. So they say, okay, we're going to teach them how to swim. And, you know, if you shave your fur, you're going to be more like us and it's going to be easier to swim. No, go outside the water and try to realize what it's like to be out there and find adapted ways and, you know, that support them.
Well said. Well said. And Joel, so I'll have you jump in with the next question.
Yeah, thanks, Mim. Great comments, Rene. I think people tend to just move forward or move ahead. They've been given a task and they just don't think, they do. And we need to step back and step outside and look at what's going on and ask the questions. So here's the second question. What are some of the ways a country's culture and political climate impact closing the gaps regarding gender inequity, racism, diversity, and inclusion? And please, could each of you just remind us where you are So Karlyn, why don't we start with you?
So I am from the Caribbean. I was born and raised in St. Lucia in a tiny village called Bas-Labowie. And I grew up with no electricity, no running water, no access to internet. So if this was 43 years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And I currently now reside in Toronto, Canada. I've been in Canada for the past 17 years. One of the ways I would say is to recognize how patriarchy has impacted the policies and procedures and practices that drive the norms in all countries. Unless we center the ways that systemic racism has been formed, looking at it through the lens of patriarchy as well, we won't be able to fully address the gaps. We have to understand that part of social norm or part of the unlearning is first recognizing that, looking at what has worked so far, what isn't working, and how can we inform new policies and practices. And that means we need more women with intersecting identities to be in decision-making seats so that we can actually start making that change. We need more of a collective force as well, not just within the country, but we also need the influence from outside the country as well to ensure that things are being done in a way where the needs of the most marginalized are being seen, are being heard, and are being met. So for me, it's a multi-layered approach, and it's an approach that doesn't need to come from only the marginalized groups. We know that systems don't dismantle themselves, people do. But those who are most marginalized, like Black people and Latinos, and those at other intersecting identities, we did not create those systemic, those systems. So we are not the ones who should be dismantling those systems as well. So I would say it starts with first that awareness, having the conversation, making sure the conversation is spread broad and wide. And as we continue to speak up, we need more people speaking up on our behalf as well. There is a concept of allyship, which really for me, it's more about advocating for what is right, being on the right side of history in terms of advocating for justice. So where women and girls and the most marginalized are actually seen as a priority and equity can be given to all. So I would start there, Joel.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it's so important that we need to have, again, these conversations within our organizations so everyone understands. I mean, you just may not realize what you're doing because you've always done it that way and you don't take into account others. Gina, can I ask you to?
Yes. Well, I am from Mexico. Mexico is incredibly enough in the public sector, we are very advanced. We are a 50-50 in all the public sector, all across, 50-50 women, men. In the lower chamber, in the high chamber, we're all, equality is really there. But the issue is really the private sector. You know, the private sector doesn't get it because we are, you know, the board representation in Mexico is 6%. 6% women representation in the boards, which is absolutely ridiculous. And this is including family businesses. So that's even, that even makes it worse. And, you know, I think that one of the issues, you know, we also have you know, it's allowed same-sex marriage in Mexico, which that's great. We don't have issue with that. But the problem is again, you know, when you try to go into the private sector, that's a killer, because we have found that, you know, it is very difficult for LGBTQ plus to go into the private sector in leadership positions. The problem, I think, it's education. You know, when you have a girl, you start, you know, buying her, like, what can I tell you, little Barbie dolls, you know, you dress her as a princess and you try to tell her to aim to find the, you know, the prince and the king to get married, and the boys getting chemistry, you know, sets and Lego things and things to build things. And so you have to change even how the parents educate the kids. You know, we have a lot of poverty in our country, so we have to change how to teach, you know, STEM and STEAM to kids. We are pro STEAM because we believe that art and innovation is a key to change the countries. But, you know, our country is very advanced in the public sector, very really far behind in the private sectors.
Thanks, Gina. You know, when I watch game shows, and typically I guess they're from America, there's a lot to be understood and gained from that. If you think of the game show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And when the question is asked, you know, can you choose the audience? Almost always the audience has the correct answer. And why is that? It's because there's so many people in the audience. So if you think about that in terms of an organization, the more people you have that have different perspectives, the better opportunity you have to get the best results. And so that's something that leaders need to consider if they are truly concerned about advancing their organizations. So Rene, can I ask you to answer this one?
Yeah, I love the image that you've just given. I'm going to bounce on it because obviously there is a lot of wealth of knowledge and information in the audience, but it's also about who gets to be on the chair and who gets to win the million as a result of all this wealth of knowledge, you know. And you know, more often than not, unfortunately, it's not the diverse candidate. Of course, it's not based on any empirical evidence. You know, I'm just kind of using that to make a point. And I agree with the point that Gina made about educating children. You know, I think we made great progress in educating girls and telling girls you can be anything you want. And, you know, so the world is the oysters. I think there's still a little bit of hesitation from parents about allowing boys to be, you know, to be emotional and all those characteristics that are traditionally associated with girls, or to wear something pink, you know, and so I think that's where the real progress is. It's the same for the jobs. You know, I think we've empowered women to compete for traditional men jobs. I would like to see men compete for traditional women's jobs as well. And, you know, how many secretaries do you have in a company that are male? You know, it's those little things as well that I think there we will really have achieved equality, because all the jobs, whatever they've been associated with in history, will be seen as equally valuable. I think COVID has helped a little bit because we've realized that a lot of those jobs that are not well paid are actually essential to the functioning of society. Whether it will change anything, you know, obviously it's hard to know. But I do believe otherwise that governments do a lot to influence and their culture and their history. I love history because it helps me understand the psyche of a country. My wife is British. I spent half of my life in the UK or associated with the UK, and there's a lot of guilt there about slavery and it's good now that it's beginning to come out. Statues are being toppled, including inside the college campuses of the top universities, and it's generated a good debate. But you see also the reactionary movements taking place, you know, and so you know that will need to be long lasting. The short-term movements where there's a lot of noise being made, I'm always a bit worried about because they don't tend to last. So I think what we need to do now is really to support that, because it's a long-term effort.
Well said, Rene. You know, I think that we really have to level set around these conversations that we've had in businesses. We've been talking about women in leadership and gender inequity and racism and diversity for 20, 30, 40. I mean, many of us have been around for a long time and heard these discussions. So from the panel's perspective, with all these affinity groups, with all this focus, with let's have LGBTQ, you know, we're going to have Gay Pride Month and Women's Month and Black History Month and all these things. Why has this not progressed faster? What are some of the deeper pieces in here that we need to start to root out to make real progress, to go beyond just conversation, but take real action steps? So I'm going to start with you, Rene. We'll kind of go the reverse this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in the corporate world, my belief is that progress has a bit got stuck at unconscious bias level. You know, I think it was great to do this kind of training. People enjoy doing it, but it was more like a game, you know, oh yes, unconscious bias, but it didn't go the next level, is what to do with that and how to resolve that. You know, I've said it before, we need to invest in men, but in general, we need to invest in anyone who's in the traditional group that is in power, and go beyond the well-intended. One thing I learned from consultants I work with is, before there were the old-fashioned isms, and of course they still exist, of racism, sexism, homophobia, where one group really believes they're superior to the others and treat them like that. But one of the biggest issues we still have in the corporate world is the modernisms, where both groups believe in equality and they think that it's enough to be well-intended for the problems to be solved. And also they tend to see the world very binary, you know, where when they are being given some feedback, they say, but I'm not racist, because they believe it's an either no or answer. In fact, it's not an either or answer. It would be a lot easier if we saw it on a continuum, on a scale of 0 to 100. Where are you? You know, there's in the LGBT movement, there is something called the Riddle Scale, where it's like an 8-level gradient to see where people are. And on the two sides that are still on the negative side of the scale are the words acceptance and tolerance, you know. And a lot of people say, oh, I'm acceptant or I'm tolerant or whatever, thinking they're doing well, and therefore, how dare you accuse me of? But in fact, not realizing that there's a lot more to do before we are where we are. And so I think helping people to realize that and to accept that even though they're well-intended, there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made is probably the next challenge for a lot of companies.
Yeah, well said. Gina?
You know, I think that one of the things that will be very important, and it's starting to happen, is the big companies to take a stand, to take a public stand, like which one? Like BlackRock, for example. Because, you know, governments can do whatever they do, but this is public sectors, and public sectors can, you know, can impact so much. But I think if the big companies take a stand, take a public stand, because people say they are, you know, it's funny because they say, no, I mean, I love LGBTQ+, you know, I have a gay friend. I mean, that's the most ridiculous answer anybody can say. Or I'm not a racist, I have a black friend, or I have a black whatever, you know, it's ridiculous. I mean, they don't really understand what being really true to what they say, you know, it is. So I do think that if companies like BlackRock, like Goldman Sachs, take a stand and they said, we're not investing, period, in companies that do not have, you know, diversity, women on the top, diversity, race on the top, we will not put an investment on those companies. You know, that is really taking a stand and making things move. Another thing that I think it is very important is that very close, I mean, in a very few years, close to $4 trillion are going to pass from baby boomers to millennials. And that is a fact. And millennials can have a lot of issues. You know, people complain about millennials. I deal with them in my university. But they have a very good thing, which is they are born with diversity. They are born with race acceptance. They are born with LGBTQ+ acceptance, most of them. And they invest in impact investing companies. They will not invest in companies that are not, you know, they invest in wellness as well. You know, so they invest in companies that are the companies that we want, the companies that are with diversity, with race, with inclusion, with wellness. So this is a hope, because $4 trillion are going to be in their hands. And if that happens, and Goldman Sachs take a stand, and BlackRock take a stand, and most of the huge elephants take a stand, I think it's going to speed things up.
I think well said. And I think it goes back to, again, this business case and this discussion around conscious capitalism. And you're seeing these Gen Zers and younger millennials stand up, not only internally in their companies, which is starting to shift things in a very different way than we've seen in the past. And that's exciting. But we often think about investment from a sustainability perspective, you know, where we don't want to buy products that are polluting our world. And I know that Gina's measurement and some of the discussions that we've had around that, there is going to be this shift. Do I want to work for a company that doesn't truly include people? Do I want to buy products from a company or go to a place where I think that workforce is not being treated in the way that I believe they should be treated? So it is going to start to impact the bottom line in some very different ways. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karlyn for the last word on that question.
A lot of organizations did, you know, affinity groups as a checkbox to show that, hey, we're being equitable and we are really creating an inclusive workforce or workplace culture. The problem with that, with affinity groups and ERGs, is that they're not seen as true equity partners. If they were, there would have been a proper budget line on the organization's budget to ensure that they are getting the right support, they're getting the right executive sponsor. There is a return on investment, meaning that those groups would be used as a funnel for getting more a talent to push through the pipeline, getting feedback. Do our recent leadership practices and policies are working? And most importantly, it wouldn't be so hard. When I speak to some of the Black ERG leaders here in Canada and also globally, it's really hard to get an executive sponsor. But when it comes to pride, it's oh yes, let's all do it. So you have to take a look at it through the lens of intersectionality. You have to look at it through the lens of race plus gender, because what you find happening in those affinity groups, women, which really speaks to white women, and LGBTQ, which speaks to white gay men, are the ones prioritized. So are you really doing true equity work? Are you doing racial justice work? And the answer is no. What you're managing is the personal discomfort of those in power, who are usually white people. So you're looking at what I call white SPF, white superiority, white privilege, and white fragility. So we need to take a really bold stand, and unconscious bias training is not the answer. It's not. It is one. And if we really want to get to the root cause to get people to be really more inclusive and to treat all humans right, you have to look at unconscious racial bias, right? Because if you look at the roots of racism and the structures of racism, yes, it's institutional, it's systemic, but it's interpersonal as well. And when we think about how children are indoctrinated, meaning that Black history is not being taught, Latina history is not being taught in schools, what does that mean? Bias means that you are operating from what you have been exposed to. So if you haven't been exposed to Black history, and I know, Rene, you mentioned that, you like looking back to history because it helps you to make a more informed decision in the present. Very true. So when people do general unconscious bias training, does that training include racial justice? Does that training include what has been done to Blacks for over 4 centuries, for over 400 years? The fact that we were slaves and we didn't get the right, where we weren't paid, period. And plus, after slavery was abolished, we were sent out into the world, but still segregated. And equity is about recognizing that not everyone started off in the same place. And I find like unconscious bias training and a lot of those, really fancy terms that a lot of white people put forward is just a way to continue maintaining the status quo. So we need braver leaders. And I often go back to the words of Austin Shannon Brown from the US. And she says that the work of anti-racism is being a better human so that you can be a better human to all humans. Mm. So I want people to dig deep on your courage. If your company is coming to you saying we're doing unconscious bias training, push back and say, we need to combine this with anti-racism training, anti-Black racism training. We need to understand, because the brain loves specificity. You cannot just talk about general unconscious bias training. If we truly want to create an equitable world, we have to do better. And it begins with each of us standing up courageously and saying, hey, I think there's an opportunity here for us to be better. This is how we get to true racial justice.
100%. I would add too that women make up 50% of the potential global workforce. 50%.
And we're paid less.
And white women get paid less, but women of color get paid less. Yes. And this goes back to, are we getting equal pay for equal work? For all of us, whether we're talking about this through a gender lens, a diversity lens, a racism lens. If we do not have pay equity, we do not have healthcare equity. And if we do not have healthcare equity, we do not have a healthy workforce. So the pieces of the puzzle fit together very nicely. We're almost at the end of our conversation. This has been amazing. Joel, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks. Great comment, Karlyn. We need to push back when we see things that shouldn't be happening. So the final question is, what is an action step, a single action step that a leader should take now if they want to make meaningful change? So Gina, let's start with you, please.
I think the single step would be to measure. That's to me, it's my goal. To measure in their companies or in whatever they are, to measure the gender and diversity and race where they are, their policies. What is the measure, how they are seen, what is their position as far as women, LGBTQ, race, where are they standing? And once they know where they're standing, what are the things they have to change in order to achieve a full gender, diversity, and race conscious company? I think if each company does that, because to my surprise, even big companies don't have a clue. So to me, I think that's my #1 goal.
Great, thanks, Gina. Rene?
Yeah, for me, it's begin with yourself. You know, everyone in this call is sexist, racist, homophobic, you know, use all the terms. Why? Because even though we're probably ahead of many others, we're still not there yet. So go deep within and try to find what it is that still needs to be addressed. And then work with your leadership team as well. It always starts at the top. The top has to set the culture because they, you know, they still hold the power, unfortunately. And this is a long lasting effort. It's not a quick fix. It's not a thing you can go in a classroom and fix in, you know, in looking at a bunch of slides. It's day in, day out work that needs to be supported by people who understand the dynamics and can help explain and can hold the hands and can support and can nurture and all of that. And as we've heard before, be ready to implement real change as well. You know, for instance, now I have college-age daughters, and I was thinking about a fair admission to schools. And I said, yeah, but if there's more Black girls going to school, there'll be less places for my daughters. And yeah, it's true, but you know, it's tough, but that's the way it should be. But who as a parent wants to make the world more difficult for their kids? So that's the difficult, you know, us as white people and as men, we have to deal with as well, is we have to correct it at the systemic level, and we have to deal with the consequences at the personal and interpersonal level, and be okay with that.
Great, thanks. Karlyn?
Yeah, I mean,
Gina.
Gina and Rene just, you know, nailed it. It's systemic. Racism is systemic, so you need to approach it from a layered approach. And you know, and as Mim mentioned as well, it's a lifetime thing. So you can't unlearn 4 centuries of racism in one day or 1 year. It's a journey, right? And as Rene mentioned, it is internal as well, interpersonal. So you have to be aware of your biases, and remember that biases can come from, it can be gender-based, it could be race-based, it could be, you know, homophobic. There are different layers to this. So pace yourself. But most importantly, I want to challenge each and every one of you. And if you haven't done any anti-racism or any anti-Black racism training, go back to your organization or even for yourself personally and begin there. Because the more you expand your consciousness about what it is and what it involves, then you will be better prepared to step up and say, hey, maybe I should call my school and advocate so that we can have more Black history being taught. Or I can call my health, you know, my local health minister and say, why aren't we prioritizing race-based data? Like, you will find more ways to help. You'll be able to leap forward, listen to Black experiences, understand what racism is, and then start there. And remember that we need every single human on this earth to help create a better world. So we're counting on you for the journey ahead.
The humanness in all of us and being able to see that. Well, this has been amazing. We are almost finished, so I'm going to condense what we were going to do because this was such a great conversation. We want to quickly call out 3 organizations that have made measurable change, not just talked about it, and that information is public. So I'm going to mention them. I'm not going to go into the stories. One is Nest UK. That's the National Employment Savings Trust in the UK, a financial firm. Measurable change around gender equity and leadership, and now they are systematically working on their diversity and inclusion. So happy to share more information about them. Amazing company. A design firm called Meteor. They went from having one white woman on their leadership team. Now 60% of their leadership team is female and reflective of their culture. And last but not least, I wanted to bring up the Breakers of Palm Beach, because that is where the summit is going to be. And their leadership team has done a tremendous job in getting more women into leadership, and acknowledge that they have to do a better job around diversity and inclusion, and are now taking steps forward. So companies are out there, and we applaud everyone that is making this a priority and understands the business case for this. Special thank you to Susie Ellis and Nancy Davis, the Global Wellness Institute team, to our Wellness at Work initiative colleagues. And we want to thank everybody on this call today for your leadership. And for those of you that are making measurable steps forward, congratulations. Please share your success stories. Let's push other organizations to do the same. We need to have a healthier, more inclusive, and more sustainable world. And so I'm going to leave you with this thought. Joel showed you that great slide of people sitting around a table. But maybe it's not about just creating more seats at that table, but maybe we really need to think about what's the size of the table, what's the shape of the table, and who are the people that we really need to be at that table to move our companies forward. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I'll leave the last word to Rene Bujard.
Well, I was blown away by this session. Mim and Joel, Karlyn, Gina, and Rene, thank you so much. And I'd love to, if Susie or Nancy want to say anything from the Global Wellness Institute about this collaboration. We have been so grateful for the collaboration with the Institute to put the series on. So anything that you guys would like to say to close the session?
I don't know if Nancy, you want to hop in, or I just want to say thank you to you, Rene, and Mim, and Joel, and Karlyn, and Gina, and Rene. You were great. I've learned a lot from this, and it is something that both the Global Wellness Summit and the Global Wellness Institute, we want to do better in this arena. And so what you have done today has been very helpful, and we just really are glad for any help we can get from you as the initiative, because we just want to do better. And I just thank you for a great session, for putting this together. And I can tell it took a lot to put it together. You were all very well prepared, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I just want to echo just a real gratitude for putting this on, for spending the time, for collaborating so well with all of us for so long. Mim, the work that you do, Rene, the work that everyone does. And I will just invite you to bring this conversation and this panel to the summit. And in the context of a place like the Breakers that does this well and cares about this deeply, our organization, all women, very diverse. Let's bring this to the forefront and the conversation to the summit. So I would ask you to come and share this from the stage, and let's get everybody really to understand what we need to do. So thank you.
Welcome.
Much well-being to everyone. Have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.